A very common question I get asked due to my area of study and interest in issues related to early Christian manuscripts and textual issues with the Bible is in regard to the issue of the longer ending of Mark's gospel. Because if you turn in a modern Bible translation to the end of Mark's gospel, you're going to see something a little bit unusual going on partway through chapter 16. For example, the New International Version has a blank space and then a line, and then in square brackets it says, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20, followed by a space, and then the text continues. The CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, has the same space and line format, but in its note says some of the earliest manuscripts conclude with 16:8. And this is the pattern you'll see consistently throughout modern English Bibles. So, what's going on here? Well, in answering this question, let me start by moving from the known to the unknown. Mark 16:9 through 20 is found in nearly every New Testament manuscript and is the single longest textual variant in the New Testament. However, it is missing from two very significant manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. And these are significant because Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are our earliest witnesses to the end of Mark. So we actually have manuscripts of Mark, like P45, that are older than Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, but they don't have this latter half of Mark in particular. It's just missing from these documents. And that's extremely common. If you simply just think about a codex, what we would call a book, the beginning and the ends are the most vulnerable places, right? You can see, like, you can imagine that the most exposed to the elements, to wear, to those kinds of things, is the beginning and the ends of a book. So we have a lot of middles of books, but we tend to more often than not miss the beginnings and the ends. And this is especially true when we're dealing with documents that are 1,000+ years old and tend to have very little evidence to begin with, the further we go back. So the first time that we have a copy of Mark, which includes the longer ending, is in Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. Now, you can go online and see all three of these manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. They've all been digitized, and high-resolution images are available to the public. But due to my academic work, I have facsimile copies of these documents, or at least I have the entirety of the New Testament of Alexandrinus here that I've purchased myself from the British Library. I also have Codex Vaticanus of the New Testament here, and the Clementine epistles are in there. And then I have the entirety of Codex Sinaiticus. So I have both, the Old and New Testament, along with all the other books that are included within Codex Sinaiticus. So those are three manuscripts that, along with a number of other of the facsimiles that I use on a regular basis, so that I don't have to rely on the digital images, I can use an actual hard copy of a facsimile. I have those personally. And so these are texts that I'm pretty familiar with. I've done a decent amount of work with them. And so I want to use some of the data that we can draw from both the non-existence as well as the existence of something like Mark 16:9 through 20 to help you understand and navigate this particular textual idiosyncrasy when it comes to the Bible, because there's a lot of confusion about this particular issue. So first, cards on the table, I do not think Mark 16:9 through 20 is original. I don't think Mark wrote it, and therefore I don't think it's inspired scripture. And that's the majority position of textual scholars who look and analyze the data on this issue. But there is debate. And so I don't want to make it sound like nobody thinks it's original. There are a few who argue for the originality of this particular passage to being original to Mark. Given that, what do we see when we look at these manuscripts? Well, Vaticanus in particular is very important in this discussion, because while it does not include the longer ending of Mark, we do find something that is worth taking note of. And that's what I want to highlight for a minute here. Vaticanus is a 3-column codex. At the end of Mark, we find that scribes leave the 3rd column blank. Nowhere else do the copyists of Vaticanus leave any other blank columns in the New Testament text? So, for example, here is the end of Matthew. You can see the scribe finishes the gospel partway through a column and then starts the beginning of Mark's gospel at the beginning of the next column. With Luke, the scribe is able to comfortably finish the book at the end of the column and then gives the gospel notation comfortably at the end and picks up with John in the next column. John ends at the beginning of the first column, has the title notation, and then the book of Acts starts. Here is Acts, followed by the Epistle of James, and so on and so forth. Nowhere in the entirety of Vaticanus's New Testament do we ever see anything other than when the book is finished, the next book immediately starts in the following column. Blank spaces? Of course, at times, but only in the column where the book ends, right? So the rest of the column is left blank, and then the next book is immediately started in the next column. The only place in the entirety of Codex Vaticanus's New Testament where an entire blank column is left is at the end of Mark. On top of that, if we account for the average space between the letters, the average amount of words per column, and the approximate letter size for the scribe who wrote the Gospel of Mark, and we factor all that in and fill in the gap with a reconstructed text, 16, 9 through 20, and the standard title inscription for the Gospel according to Mark fits exactly in the space left at the end of Mark in Codex Vaticanus. I think that's very important to take note of. For me personally, at minimum, I believe this points to the scribes of Vaticanus's New Testament knowing about a further reading, they themselves not believing that that reading was original, but nonetheless doing their due diligence in leaving the appropriate amount of space for a potential later scribe who maybe had more available data to point to the text's authenticity to write it in. I think that's important. Now, we also find a space at the end of Codex Sinaiticus. However, we cannot convey the same sort of scribal anomaly that we see in Vaticanus, because while Sinaiticus has a space, that space is neither unusual as it goes for other endings of other books in its New Testament text, nor does it do what Vaticanus does with leaving the completely unique blank column. But, and there is a but here, when you get into the nitty-gritty of Sinaiticus, you do actually find something going on with the ending of Mark's Gospel. Particularly, the text of Mark, chapter 15, verses 54 to chapter 16, verses 8, and then the beginning of Luke, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 56, are not written by the scribe of the pages before and after. And we know this based on comprehensive analysis of the handwriting by individuals who focus on that. They're called paleographers. And we can analyze this in what we call the scribal hand of the copyist. And I want you to stay with me here because I'm going to get technical for a minute. But although originally the scribe wrote at a rate of 635 letters per column, in Luke, he drastically compressed his lettering at a rate of 690 letters per column. But near the end of Mark, we see the opposite being done. He expanded his letters in the first column of the third page. And because of this, the scribe would not have reached the end of verse 8 in this column. And effectively, if they had stayed with the amount of space they usually would have had, they would have had an entire column blank. So the scribe would not have reached the end of verse 8 in this column, leaving the entire next column blank. But the scribe clearly doesn't want to do that. So he not only expanded his lettering, but also made this decorative scribal marker at the end, what some textual scholars have called distinctively emphatic. And this, I think we can see that, here's a scribal marker at the end of Matthew. It measures about 2 centimeters in length. Luke has no scribal marker. at the end of his gospel in Sinaiticus. John's marker in Sinaiticus is also 2 centimeters, matching Matthew's, but Mark's is not only more decorative in style, but measures 6 centimeters in length. It's more than twice the size of the other decorative markers we find, particularly in the Gospels. So when we are looking at Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, our earliest witnesses to the ending of Mark, we see that they're missing this passage, but I also think there's ground to at least admit that both have unique idiosyncrasies when it comes to this particular passage that indicate a relatively strong argument in my mind that the scribes were aware of additional material after verse 8, and though decide not to include it for I think the right reasons, because I don't think it's original, they indicate that something is going on in the exemplars that they are using and that they themselves are likewise copying. And I would argue that even when we move to Codex Alexandrinus, our earliest example of it being included, that particular manuscript, though it does include Mark 16, 9 through 20, as our first witness historically to that text, we see the copyists likewise making an emphatic decorative design that both differs significantly from the ending of the other Gospels and is larger. Is this up for debate? Of course. Textual scholars go back and forth on this stuff and have, if you look at, say, the textual commentaries by individuals like Tommy Wasserman and Bruce Metzger and Philip Comfort, Brent Nongbury, all of these scholars they go back and forth on these issues. So there are consensuses on this, something like, the longer ending of Mark not being original. But even though there is debate, I think even the debate recognizes that there's something going on within the endings of these particular Gospels and something very different going on when we look at Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus in regards to the ending of Mark that indicates that the scribes are themselves aware of idiosyncrasies going on in the manuscripts that they are copying from. And let me also note that my area of research is in what's called paratextual features. So these are the types of scribal markers, the things that we're looking at that I'm describing in this video. These are my bread and butter. I spend a great deal of my time throughout the week, my days, doing things like measuring spaces between words and taking note of when a scribe all of a sudden does something different. Because scribes and copyists tend to do things on purpose when it comes to these features. And reader's aids that more often than not are indicating either something the reader or something to a later scribe who is using this particular text as an exemplar to copy a later manuscript. And I would contend that based on the fact that this is my, particular area of research, that although I do not think that Mark 16, 9 through 20 was written by Mark, simultaneously, the scribes of Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus are aware of something going on in the manuscript traditions leading up to the 4th and 5th centuries in the case of the end of Mark, and they're noting that. And we find these sorts of patterns in later manuscripts as well. In family F1, manuscript 205, and many others, scribes leave what are called critical marks, such as an asterisk or an obelix, which indicate that the scribe knew of the questionable nature of this particular passage, and whether they include it or don't include it, they are noting in the margins or in somewhere around the text to indicate to the reader and to subsequent copyists that something's going on here. You need to take notice. On top of that, there are actually 5 endings throughout the manuscript tradition of the end of Mark's gospel. 5 endings, one of which is simply ending at 16:8, which is what Vaticanus and Sinaiticus do. But there are some manuscripts that had a different shorter ending. There are some like Codex Washingtonianus that adds an entire paragraph to the longer ending between what we have as verses 14 and 15. And then there's, of course, the ending that we find in full after the textual note in our modern Bibles that encompasses 16, 9 through 20, the traditional ending. And we would say that if we're going to outline any credible options in the mix of those five, what we're looking at are either the complete longer ending or the shorter ending simply stopping at verse 8. In terms of the textual data, the other endings are really they're either anomalies or they're singular attempts. But of those five options that we see throughout the manuscript traditions, the ones that are really only in true contention for potentially being original are, the longer ending, 16, 9 through 20, or simply ending at verse 8. Now, there have been hypotheses concerning the ending being lost. There have been some explanations that speculate that Mark was writing maybe during an era of particularly noteworthy persecution, and he simply didn't get the time to end his gospel on time. I'm not sure I find any of those hypotheticals hugely convincing. At minimum, what we have with the longer ending communicates a style, syntax, grammar, and content which does not fit either Mark's gospel as a whole or even just leading up to the ending of Mark. The Greek in 16:9 through 20 is quite different, somewhat awkwardly reintroduces Mary Magdalene, who has already appeared 3 times in the latter sections of Mark, and it seems to draw a particular style and content from Luke's gospel. And this has been noted by multiple scholars over the years. For example, the appearance of 2 people walking in the country parallels the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. The appearance of the 11 while reclining from Luke 24, 36 to 43, and the ascension looks like Luke 24:50 to 51. And this is what textual scholars call a syncretizing feature. In that, later scribes, potentially surprised by the abrupt nature of the ending of Mark's gospel at 16:8, which has the women at the tomb afraid, and it says that they didn't tell anyone, then attempt to amalgamate content from Luke. And one of the arguments that is discussed is that the gospel in Greek ends with the conjunction gar, which in English we translate as for. Now, it has often been thought that this is unlikely that a book would end with the word for. It just is awkward grammatically, and that's true. Like, you wouldn't end a sentence in English with the word for, and you also, although word order is less important in Greek, it's still kind of messy to end with the word gar in Greek. For anyone who's overall familiar with Mark's writing style in Greek, he's not exactly hugely eloquent anyways. So there's something to say of the fact that Luke and Matthew and John are just better writers, and Mark is kind of awkward in general. And we do actually have precedent in both Koine Greek and Classical Greek with documents ending in for. In fact, Plato actually ends his work, The Republic, with gar as the last word of a book as he concludes the dialogue of Socrates' statements about the afterlife and the reward for living a just life. So it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. So given the fact that we have a multiplicity of endings that crop up, given the unusual wording, syntax, and grammar considering the rest of the style of Mark's gospel, and despite the fact that I think the earliest witnesses like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus don't include it, and Alexandrinus does, and all 3 manuscripts in my estimation show evidence of being aware of something going on in the textual tradition of the end of Mark, I still would say it's not original. I think the internal evidence for its exclusion is strong. I think that there's a reason that the scribes in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus don't include it, albeit they're trying their due diligence, in this case, correctly, to notify later readers and copyists of something going on there. And I haven't even touched on the patristic evidence from the early Christians who appear to be aware, or even the ones who appear to be unaware of the reading. Nonetheless, while I think the extra added on part of, the longer ending or some of these other attempts at endings, they pop up early in the manuscript tradition, maybe even as early as the 2nd century, I don't think Mark wrote it. And therefore, I don't think it's scripture. Let me add that I did do a Facebook Live almost 5 years ago where I ran through more possible reasons why longer endings of Mark were added. So if you're interested, you can check out that video. I'll add it in the link in the description.